Hello, everyone. Welcome to AdMonsters 2023 LinkedIn Live recap. Every year we do end of the year content to kind of reflect on what happened throughout the year. We do AdMonsters top articles, but this year we wanted to spice things up a little bit. This is why we created our LinkedIn Live, and we wanted to discuss some of the hottest topics in 2023, such as Media Mad's untimely death or resurrection. Are we ready for Chrome's third-party cookie deprecation? And to help us discuss these things, we have Kane, founder of Jounce Media, who I know is always has his pulse on the industry. Thank you, Chris, for joining us today. And
Thanks, Andrew.
before we jump into everything, I just want to say I do see a lot of people are utilizing the chat. If you have any questions throughout, please pop them in there and I'll try my best to read them off. If you have one specific to the hot topic that we're talking about, I try to ask it there. But if I miss them, I'll just make sure to get to them at the end. And before we kind of jump in, Chris, I know a lot of people do know who you are, but for those who don't, can you give a little bit of intro about yourself and the work you do at Jounce Media?
Of course, yeah. So I think the short of it is we're a research company with an extremely narrow focus. We study the way that money moves from DSPs to publishers. And to be good at that, we consume data from a lot of different places, some public data like ads.txt and sellers.json files, but also a lot of private data sources, these data sharing agreements that we've established with large media buyers who give us rights to study their campaigns to understand how real DSP campaigns are deploying their investments. And so the core of our business is this daily updating data set that measures the way that money is moving through the programmatic supply chain across web, mobile app, and CTV supply. And then we write a bunch of research on top of that to try to help our clients understand industry trends.
And that very reason is why we wanted to have this conversation with you today, just because you do have your pulse on so many trends with your research and things as such. And before we kind of jump into the specific hot topics, I always do like to start off these LinkedIn Lives with an icebreaker. So I was just curious, before we get into the hot topics, was there any ad tech news that surprised you, that kind of had you clutching your pearls a little bit? If so, can you walk me through what that was and how it developed throughout the year? Okay, just to repeat the question, was there any ad tech news that surprised you this year? If so, can you walk me through how it developed throughout the year?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think probably the most surprising thing was starting to really see some consolidation on the sell side of the market, and specifically the collapse of EMX, which I don't think got a whole lot of headlines because it was a relatively small business. But the reason it surprised me is that while there had been sort of some concern, I guess, among publishers for a long time that there might be some risk of a variety of SSPs sort of defaulting, that I just think the industry, for a variety of reasons that we can talk about if you want, tends to sort of like protect ad tech companies from, particularly on the sell side of the market, from consolidation. And so to actually see an SSP fail, to my mind, was sort of an interesting signal that like maybe we're entering a new era in the industry where we actually will see some consolidation on the sell side of the market.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I don't want to dig into that too much because I do know we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So I will hop on into our first hot topic, which is cookie deprecation and the privacy sandbox. And I know a lot of people, when Chrome first announced they were deprecating third-party cookies, a lot of people were scrambling. A lot of people were like, are they going to actually do it? Because it's been a couple of years since they said they were announced that they were going to do it. But since third-party cookie deprecation is starting next year, I was curious that how do you see the industry preparing for Chrome's third-party cookie deprecation? I know you have your ears to the streets. Are we prepared? Is there a lot more work that needs to be done?
Yep. I have two thoughts on this one. The first is pretty timely, I guess. It was either today or yesterday that pretty senior person, Bill Simmons from the Trade Desk, put out a blog post that and that I would argue was like a pretty clear signal that would indicate they're not going to build against privacy sandbox. Like they're out, which I don't feel like I fully processed yet, but that seems quite significant. And then the other thing that's sort of happening in parallel with this is more and more publishers adopting probabilistic identity solutions
Mm-hmm.
that simply populate bid requests with the best guess of a cookie ID. And those solutions sometimes have very high integrity, and I think sometimes have very low integrity. But what they all have in common is that they allow the ad tech apparatus to continue to operate basically without change, even in non-cookied environments like Safari.
Mm-hmm.
And so my guess here is that like the real evolution is that whenever it is that Chrome fully deprecates third-party cookies, that for large portions of the industry, Chrome APIs will not be the solution. User authentication will not be the solution. Seller-defined audiences will not be the solution. And that what will actually be like the bulk of the solution, if you want to call it that, is probabilistic population of cookie IDs so that bid requests look the same to DSPs as they always have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And I know, especially since it's Chrome who's deprecating third-party cookies, Privacy Sandbox for a lot of people kind of has been like the shiny new toy. But I also do know, like, even at some of our conferences, we would ask people like, are they testing the Privacy Sandbox? And overwhelmingly, there was a lot of people who are not. So do you think enough people are testing the Privacy Sandbox where it can be effective? Do you think it's too early to say just because Chrome isn't fully deprecated yet? What do you think about that?
Well, certainly there's not nearly enough testing.
Mm-hmm.
And, this industry is big on sort of like waiting for emergencies to solve problems.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that's what's going to happen. We're going to have a big friggin' emergency whenever it is that cookies are fully deprecated. And I think a lot of companies are going to get caught flat-footed. Maybe there's another way in which consolidation really starts to happen. There are companies that are making the bet that they want to allocate engineering resources to sort of like properly building support for Chrome APIs. There are other companies who are saying, "Oh, that's not the Trade Desk." It seems is saying, "Well, that's not the bet we want to make." But they're also dedicating huge resources to other solutions to sort of like cope with a post-cookie internet. And then there's other companies who kind of have their head in the sand and are doing nothing. And maybe that is a catalyst that the industry kind of needs to just see the ad tech world kind of thin out so that there aren't dozens or hundreds of ad tech companies, but that, you get down to sort of a short list of long-term winners.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sometimes you do kind of have to learn the hard way and go through the struggle before you kind of get that push to get things moving. And you did kind of mention a little bit of a prediction that you think there's going to be a state of an emergency based on like people not testing Privacy Sandbox or testing post third-party cookie solutions enough. So do you have like any more predictions on top of that you want to tell the audience?
Well, I guess maybe one other sort of like consideration is if you sort of believe my view that a large portion of the internet in, call it 12 months, will be monetized using probabilistic identity, meaning the bid request declares some ID that is targetable by the DSP. That might be a short-term solution, but it opens up a new problem, which is an inability to attribute which ads are driving sales. And so to the extent ad tech companies are doing anything today, what I see them doing is building solutions for targeting at the expense of not spending any time designing solutions for attribution. And if the answer isn't literally there's no solutions for attribution. Chrome's done some very thoughtful things to enable attribution. But I don't see ad tech companies spending much product time building against those future-proofed attribution systems, which means that like, in a year, 18 months from now, you might find an internet where impressions continue to be targetable, meaning you can run a retargeting campaign, but you can't, or DSPs and other ad tech companies will have a very hard time measuring which ads are actually driving business outcomes.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. And before we hop on to the next topic, I wanted to see if anyone had any questions looking in the chat. It looks like there isn't, but I mean, I have kind of a question for you guys that you can sound off on. Are you guys mostly focusing on targeting, like Chris said, or are you focusing on attribution? Let me know in the comments. And now on to hot topic number 2, we have the Media Math bankruptcy, which I think sent shockwaves throughout the entire ad tech industry. I remember seeing like graphics of tombstones, and a lot of people just really shocked about what was going on. And a big part of that conversation was the $100 million debt that the DSP left behind, and it left publishers, SSPs wondering who the responsibility falls on sequential liability. So for Chris, I wanted to know as how this has affected different players in the ad tech ecosystem about repayment terms, and just you will also just kind of walk me through of your thoughts on the whole MediaMath bankruptcy as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I was less surprised about the MediaMath bankruptcy than I was about EMX, not because those are bets on those companies, but sort of like structurally, there's a clear history of consolidation that's happening on the buy side of the market. And naturally in the DSP category, you get winners and losers. You get agencies who say, I'm only going to spend my money through this single DSP or these 2 or 3 DSPs. And there's some good reasons why they make those choices. Publishers make the opposite choice, right? Like publishers rationally sell through multiple dozens of SSPs. Mm-hmm. And so all I'm trying to get at is it's natural and expected that you're going to continue to see consolidation on the buy side of the market. Seeing MediaMath go bankrupt rather than being acquired was a surprise. And I think there's been some pretty good press coverage of like how that all shook out. But look, we're going to continue to see the DSP market thin out and see a fewer and fewer list of DSPs capture more and more market share. What I think really happened with MediaMath that was sort of market moving is all of a sudden the finance teams at publishers had a much greater sense of urgency to really understand how counterparty risk works. And I think publishers in many cases in almost every case are left contractually holding the bag. And in a practical sense, there really weren't very many large exchanges who made a business decision to sort of waive the sequential liability clause and eat that loss on behalf of publishers. Index Exchange did, a few other smaller exchanges did, but the largest SSPs said to publishers like, sorry, you knew the terms of the contract. You know that if one of our demand sources defaults, that we pass on that risk to you. We've outlined this very clearly in our contract. I'm like, sorry, we're going to claw back those proceeds, which is a brutal lesson for publishers to have learned, but they learned it, they really learned it. And so I do see many of the publishers that we work with putting in place much better financial controls to just sort of measure the degree to which different demand sources are showing signs of insolvency, late payments, a history of inconsistent payments, that sort of thing. And so I don't know that affects the movement of money today, but I do think the next time you see a large source of demand start to exhibit signs of insolvency or risk of non-payment, that you're going to see not so much ad tech companies taking quicker action, but publishers taking quicker action to protect themselves, to basically just disable access to that source of demand or put a very tight credit limit on that source of demand.
Yeah, I think you're right. And even thinking about some of the coverage that we did after the bankruptcy was announced, a lot of the SSPs who we talked to were saying like, some of them would take on the load, but I think it really just depended on the publisher relationship. But despite, I do know that like MediaMath did kind of have a little bit of a resurrection with Infilion. And of course, they might not have to take on the load of that $100 million debt based upon the way that they build themselves up. But I do think that it still will make people change the way they go about sequential liability, because if it happens again, if it happens this time, there's a possibility it can happen again, especially if a lot of DSPs are going to be filtering out, as you have said. And I know we didn't necessarily specifically talk about this for the hot topics, but we did have a question from Helene about the Infilion acquisition. And I know I just recently read an article about it where they're kind of rehiring a lot of their previous staff. I believe they rehired maybe about 40 MediaMath employees, and they're working with a lot of their old partners. And of course you don't have the answer, but do you kind of have any predictions of like, do you think they're going to be as MediaMath was? Do you think, just like what do you have like any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, firstly, like I think there's the word I'm going to use is a little charged. And I think what I'm going to say is like, it's very reasonable. But I think there's a lot of emotional reactions to say like, wait a minute, these guys burned us and now we're going to let them back into the industry. And it's like, the obvious practical choice. Well, first of all, like, you just can't penalize the acquirer for the debt of a company that it purchased. And the practical choice for every SSP and every publisher is take demand from Infileon. Like, it's the obvious, right, rational choice. And it's like, get over your feelings and start to capture the demand that exists now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, everybody's going to work with Infileon, and they should. That's the right choice.
Mm-hmm.
And then beyond that, I think I don't know that team particularly well, but certainly there's some lessons learned, from Media Math. And I think the most reductive version of it, which is too simple but is accurate, is you're not going to out trade desk the trade desk. Like, DSPs need to find a market category that they can dominate that is not already dominated by one of the industry leaders.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what the strategy is at Infileon, but it needs to be more focused, and it needs to sort of say, like, hey, we're gonna identify a pool of demand that is not well served today by the trade desk or DB360 or Amazon DSP or some of the other leaders, and work with Criteo or Yahoo. We're going to find a category that's underserved, and we're going to go dominate that subsection of the market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And now moving on to topic number 3, big tech regulation. And even just thinking about, I write about ad tech every weekend. Upon doing my research, like most weeks, one of the top stories was antitrust lawsuit against Google, antitrust lawsuit against Meta, antitrust lawsuit against Apple. And I was just curious about what is kind of your thoughts about this going on. A lot of people in the industry for years have been talking about big tech's monopoly on the ad tech industry. How do you think this kind of played out in 2023?
I don't feel like I've got like the legal foundation to sort of really build this thing out, other than to say it seems very unlikely to me that on any kind of reasonable timeline, there's going to be any kind of restructuring of the Google ad tech business. And so if that's the case, if I'm right on that, then it's all a matter of like, all right, the basic shape of the industry stays the same, but how does the threat or the reality of sort of, disputes or maybe litigation with the Justice Department or other regulatory bodies affect the way that Google operates? And I think you already see this, for example, with like the CMA negotiating with Google to have, I forget the language they use, but basically like a period of time in which the CMA can sort of weigh in on the privacy sandbox before Google fully deploys it. And what I'm trying to drive at is like the actual thing that happens is big tech moves slow and small tech moves fast. Google just cannot move at the speed that independent ad tech can. And to some degree, that's good and appropriate. And to some degree, that's sort of a problem because like the market leader really just can't innovate. Whatever the case, like the reality is independent ad tech is currently moving a lot faster than Google. And to some degree, a lot faster than Amazon, who also in different ways has a whole bunch of sort of regulatory pressure. And so, in the context of a variety of things shifting in the industry, obviously most notably is addressability, independent ad tech is going to just be able to sort of outmaneuver and I think take market share from Google.
Okay. So kind of what I hear you saying is that walled gardens are kind of forever, like they're not going to really go anywhere. But I guess my question is, based on your answer, do you think independent ad tech can kind of move on and be successful in their advertising without the help of kind of these walled gardens, if that makes sense?
Yes, I sort of bet my whole career on thinking that the open internet can succeed. And I think mainly the reason to believe it is it's all about who controls demand. Like I would imagine we have mostly a publisher audience here. The reality is publishers don't have much influence at all. They just don't have the leverage. You have leverage if you represent demand. But there are tens of billions of dollars of demand that are not controlled by the big walled gardens. They're controlled by the DSPs that I mentioned before, and to an increasing degree, even the SSPs are starting to sort of be controllers of demand. And the companies that control demand have a huge amount of leverage in the industry. We would have a real risk of sort of like instability and sort of like things are going to be structurally problematic for publishers if Google controlled 80% of demand. They control more like 50% of demand, which is still a big friggin' problem for publishers. But that leaves tens of billions of dollars that today marketers are choosing to deploy through the Trade Desk and Criteo and Yahoo and a variety of other independent DSPs.
And before I move on to the next topic, we actually did have a comment from our content manager, Lindy Johnson. She's saying we now have a quadruply: Google, Meta, Amazon, and no, not Apple. It's likely TikTok. What do you think? Is TikTok on the come up? What do you think? Are they part of the new walled garden?
I mean, for sure, they're what are they, $10 billion this year. They're gigantic, and it's all walled garden. So yes, for sure. Yeah, being a walled garden is a pretty good business. That's why the biggest companies choose to do it. They're not stupid companies. Like if it was better to as a media company to interoperate with third-party demand, every large media company would do it, but no large media company does it. At the same time, if you draw like the distribution curve of media companies, it quickly gets too small to operate as a walled garden. Pinterest is a great example of this. Pinterest is not big enough to operate as a walled garden. They are opening up their supply to third-party demand. They did it with Amazon DSP. They're going to do more. They've clearly said publicly that they are recommitting to being a part of the open internet. Roku is the same thing. Roku was like, are we going to be a walled garden or are we not? Like, they're not. They are recommitting to being interoperable with third-party demand. And so, yeah, TikTok's going to have an awesome media business as far as I can tell, and they're going to operate as a walled garden, and that's not going to be available to SSPs and DSPs. And Meta's going to stay where it is, and so is YouTube, and so are the other giant platforms. There aren't that many of them. And I think what we will find is that there is still, huge portions of ad spend that transact through, maybe it's not literally RTB over the next several decades, but things that look like RTB, where it's media companies choosing to be interoperable with third-party demand sources.
And now on to our next topic, supply chain complexity. I know you do a lot of writing and research on this. Earlier this year, our content manager, Yakira Young, wrote an article about your presentation on the state of the open internet in 2023. Can you walk us through some of the presentation's main points, specifically on fixing some of the bloatedness in the programmatic supply chain?
Yeah. So we organized, there were basically three sort of like key topics we write this report once a year. There were sort of three key topics that we covered. The one that I think is the most consequential is what you just referenced. We call it bid stream bloat. And the basic sort of like mental map that I have of how the open internet works is that publishers are rewarded for auction duplication. The more duplicate bid requests that a publisher issues to DSPs, the more demand it captures. And that's deeply dysfunctional, but it's baked in so deep to DSPs that it's real. And that's why publishers work with 10, 20, 30 different SSPs. It's an ever escalating game of one-upsmanship. If the average publisher works with 25 SSPs, you only benefit from this volume bias dynamic if you work with 26. And then once the new average is 26, now you need to work with 27. And so publishers are continuing to pump more and more requests into the sell side of the ad tech apparatus. At the same time, DSPs are either holding steady or decreasing the volume of bid requests that they can process. And so there's a lot of filtering that happens between the SSP layer and what actually gets processed by DSPs, which means that DSPs have a highly filtered view of available supply. And what actually winds up happening is DSPs see a huge amount of auction duplication for a small number of incredibly high value impressions and don't know about the existence of low value and medium value impressions. And that problem's getting worse over time. The other thing that's getting worse over time is the unit economics of ad tech companies, particularly SSPs, are deteriorating because it doesn't cost a publisher any money today to initiate an auction through an SSP, but it costs an SSP money to process that auction. And so for every auction that happens, there's cost to an SSP. But SSPs only make money when they clear an impression. And so the whole picture that I painted before says, well, there's a steady amount of DSP spend and a growing number of auctions. And so that means that the revenue of the SSPs as a category stays flat as its costs continue to grow. And so the unit economics keep getting worse and worse for SSPs. I don't see the solution. I just think we're in a real rut, and it's just not obvious at all how to get out of that rut. Probably the best plan is for DSPs to go publisher direct, for DSPs to integrate with publishers through pre-bid or something like that and see exactly one bid request for each available impression.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think a lot of people are talking about that. I think, remember, I hosted a session at Pub Forum New Orleans, which talked about the complexity in the programmatic supply chain. But the bulk of the conversation was about the sell side and the buy side kind of coming together and working out through those kinks and complexities. But one of the things that one of the speakers predicted is that they think a lot of intermediaries are going to be eliminated throughout the next year and throughout the coming years in ad tech. It sounds like you agree, but do you agree? And like, what effect do you think that can have on?
I think on a whiteboard, I agree. I just don't know if there's any evidence to support this. What
Mm-hmm.
we see is companies that I would think of as purely value extracting intermediaries, just, kind of like companies that call themselves an SSP, but that don't actually have any DSP integrations and initiate a huge number of resold auctions through other SSPs. And every publisher's adopting them and they're making money because of it. And DSPs are continuing to bid into these resold auctions. So, I mean, at some point, we've got to hit a breaking point. But I think, publishers are making decisions to hit their Q1 target and their Q2 target and their 2024 full year target. It kind of seems like the right choice is just like continue to take advantage of what's proven to work, which is to work with lots of SSPs and generate as many duplicate auctions as you can.
Mm-hmm. Okay, okay. And before we move on to the next topic, I did see a couple of questions that I think were pertinent to the discussion that we were having now. A couple of minutes ago, sorry if I mispronounced your last name, Anthony Lorado had a question. Will bidding below price floors be the trend for DSPs in the near future, do you think?
Yes, 100%. And I want to be clear about what that means, or what I mean when I say that. There's like a whole swirl. There was a whole swirl about the trade desk bidding below floors, which I think missed a really critical nuance. There's the floor price that the publisher actually sets, like the actual price below which the publisher will not sell an impression. And then there's the value that gets sent to DSPs and bid requests that is the declared floor price. Those are not the same thing. And what has happened is that the thing declared as the floor price in a bid request is guidance from the SSP on how much the DSP should bid in order to win the impression, which is usually substantially higher than the publisher's actual hard floor price. And in many cases, it's so much higher that it's actually useless guidance. It's not helpful signals for DSPs to know how much they need to bid. It's an attempt by SSPs to coax unnecessarily high bids out of DSPs.
Mm-hmm.
And we're working on some research to really substantiate that, but I've spent the last several months looking at the data. Like, that is what's happening in at least some cases. And so if you're a DSP who is being told that you have an opportunity to buy an impression where the actual floor price is 10 cents and you're being told you must bid at least $1, that's just a bad signal and you should ignore it. And you would not be doing your job to marketers if you respected that floor.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a whole interesting debate of like, should SSPs be doing this? Should they be inflating floor prices? Does it help publishers? Does it hurt publishers? Is it potentially in violation of their contracts with DSPs? Like, there's a really interesting debate here. But just like the practical choice for DSPs is it is essential to bid below the floor declared in bid requests in order to be able to transact inventory at fair market value.
Okay. Okay. And I have one more question before we go into the next topic from Trevor Abbott. Hello, Trevor. Hope you're doing well. He said, I've long been pondering on the topic, Chris, and curious to hear your thoughts. How do you think marketing and advertising will change? Will it push back to being more creative with campaigns and assets if those attribution signals aren't there? What do you think, if that makes sense?
I think in the absence of reliable attribute, well, let me take a step back. We're already living in the absence of a lot of reliable attribution signals because for many marketing categories, some of the largest ones, consumer packaged goods, pharma, local retail, it's next to impossible to have anything that resembles impression level attribution. There's exceptions. There's some like super fancy marketers who figure this stuff out. But by and large, like there's just like huge categories of marketing where you really don't have any kind of impression level attribution. What those media buyers do is optimize to proxies. They optimize to high viewability, low costs, high video completion rates. And that's the real trap. Those marketers wind up accidentally buying some of the lowest quality supply on the internet. And I think they're learning gradually that unless you have incredibly robust attribution, which many marketers don't have today, and to this point, fewer will in the future, you got to apply a lot of business oversight into the supply that you access. And so I guess my sort of like roundabout answer to that question is, I think what we will see as attribution erodes is brands and agencies being more prescriptive about the publishers that they're going to do business with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And finally, on to our last topic, which I think was a huge hot topic towards the Q4 of the year, made for advertising sites. And as I said, there has been a lot of chatter over it throughout the past year, specifically creating a core definition for the industry to see how we can name exactly or regulate what an MFA site is. Can you kind of walk me through your thoughts on how that kind of developed in 2023, and then later tell me, how do you see it going in 2024 as far as making an industry-wide definition that people can follow and things of that nature?
Sure. So we've been writing about, we started studying made for advertising supply at the end of 2020. We didn't have that word for it then, but we were trying to understand these ad arbitrage publishers. We wrote our first research about it in the summer of 21. We published a bunch of research reports to our clients since then. And from my perspective, it's been kind of a slow boil. We've been researching this. Ad tech companies have been trying to wrap their arms around it. Some ad tech companies have put policies in place to sort of manage their exposure to made for advertising supply. But things took a very sharp turn in June of this year. The ANA published its report. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with it. One of the most sort of striking findings is that they, among the sample of campaigns they studied, measured that 15% of ad spend went to made for advertising publishers. I think that's a pretty good estimate. And it was a real oh shit moment. It was like, there were many people living in ad tech land. I'm one of them, who were sort of like, yeah, I mean, of course it's happening. But I think there was a lot of people at agencies, but especially at brands, who were like, what? Like, what is this? It's like a very scary finding from the ANA that more than 10% of spend goes to very, very low quality supply. And that none of the incumbent systems, verification companies, were sort of identifying this stuff. And I think it's like a lot of buyers felt flat-footed, and it created a whole emergency. Two things have happened since then. One is really healthy and one is really unhealthy. The very healthy thing is that through a variety of different measures, SSPs implementing certain policies, DSPs implementing certain policies, all of the major verification companies rolling out solutions related to MFA, agencies implementing changes to their default inclusion list. There's been a sharp pullback in spend for MFA supply, and the market's a lot healthier today than it was over the summer. Just to put some math around that, in June, when the ANA published its report, 30% of bid requests led to MFA supply. That 30% of requests capture about 15% of spend. There's a giant portion of the bid stream. That number is below 20% today. There's been just a pullback in the existence of MFA supply because demand is no longer rewarding that supply at the same level that it was previously. That's incredibly healthy. That means more money today is going to premium publishers than it was over the summer. This is awesome. This is great progress. This is buyers voting with their wallets. The negative thing that's happened, which I did not see coming at all, and I should have, is publishers having a lot of concern that this is another black box that is going to hurt the economics of reputable media companies. And I don't think the industry is anywhere close to doing enough to sort of addressing that. I don't think, for what it's worth, the answer is having a very deterministic standard of what constitutes MFA. What that would do is give a playbook for MFA publishers to live like this far over the line and no longer be classified as MFA. That's not the solution to this problem. I think the solution to this problem is to be extremely transparent, so that publishers should be able to know exactly how they're classified by any company that's making MFA, pass-fail decisions. But we're pretty far away from that. And I think publishers understandably have a lot of anxiety about being misclassified.
Okay, and actually, we just had a question pop up from Jared Collette, who kind of read my mind and asked the question much better than I could have. He asked, what is the difference between made for arbitrage versus made for advertising? He says, I feel that by definition, they are separate, being treated as the same. Do you think, and I guess on top of that, do you think that has added to some of the confusion and some of the struggles that premium publishers have been going through?
I think a prerequisite for the, whatever you want the A to be, the prerequisite for the MFA label is a very high dependence on paid traffic. A lot of publishers that are very premium have some paid traffic, not a zero tolerance policy. Made for advertising publishers can't exist without the presence of paid advertising or ad arbitrage. And so to me, these are one and the same. But that's not universally the case. To say that differently, like when we make these determinations, when we create lists of sites that we recommend buyers block, a prerequisite for being on that MFA, being on our MFA list, is having a very high dependence on paid traffic. I don't think that's universally the case. And I think we're conflating, and Jared, I think is what you were getting at. I think the industry is conflating shitty ad experiences with ad arbitrage. And there's a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram, but there are publishers that have high ad density, rapid auto refresh that I take issue with, but that definitely do not meet the standard for MFA classification. And yet at the same time, I think in at least some cases, those publishers are being swept in with efforts to block made for advertising supply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And even kind of building on that a little bit, I know when I first started doing a little research on it, arbitrage seemed to be the main factor, but now doing more research, arbitrage is part of what makes an MFA site. But just because you do arbitrage, that doesn't necessarily make you an MFA site. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That is correct.
Mm-hmm.
To a degree, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
If here's like a basic, for publishers on the call, maybe have some heartburn about this stuff. Here's like a litmus test that I found works pretty well. If somebody mandated that you turned off all of your paid traffic, could your company still exist? And for premium publishers, the answer is definitely yes. Now, like, I might not like that. I might use arbitrage as a way, as like a supplemental revenue stream, but it is not existential. Like, I could have a viable business without ad arbitrage. If the answer to that question though is like, oh no, my business wouldn't exist if I didn't buy paid traffic, probably you're a made for advertising publisher.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I do see a lot of questions coming in, but first we have a comment. Trevor said he agreed a new acronym is we need. We have MFA, which is made for advertising, and MFAA, made for advertising arbitrage.
I mean, Trevor, I'm mostly with you, but I think the last thing this industry needs is more acronyms.
Yeah, I can't disagree. But we do also have some questions as well. Another question from Helene Parker. She's asked, so should we go whitelist or inclusion list, but isn't that going against open internet?
I think media buyers gain a lot more than they lose by operating with an inclusion list. And I think that is a more practical point of view to have today than even a year ago. There's some kind of like boring ad tech minutia here, but with some new signals that are available, particularly the manager domain and owner domain signal in ads.txt files, it's drastically easier today than it was a year ago to make really, really robust inclusion lists. And you can make a decision that says, like, I'll just give you two examples. I trust Hearst. And now that's one business choice. But now that's going to scale you across dozens of properties that are operated by Hearst. A more extreme example would be to say, like, I trust Raptive. And it's like, oh, now you're going to find 5,000 independent content creators in the long tail that are part of the Raptive portfolio and that meet certain standards. So my point of view is media buyers win much more than they, or gain much more than they lose by moving to inclusion lists, as long as those inclusion lists are really robust. And because there's better supply chain transparency today, media buyers can make really robust inclusion lists.
Okay. And one more before we, two more questions from Jared before we move on. The first one is, so what about new publishers that rely on marketing spend to drive traffic to their site to grow their brand? Publishers with good, clean sites, not ones with excessive and intrusive ads.
I think it's all a matter of degree. And I guess the main thing that I come back to I've heard that question a lot. The main thing that I keep coming back to is there are thousands of independent content creators who are methodically building an organic audience. And to the extent the industry says it's acceptable to take a shortcut and arbitrage paid traffic, and sort of like hyperscale your business overnight, that has some very negative externalities for just sort of like the viability of independent content creators or small media companies that are methodically building an organic audience that comes back over and over again. And so, of course, new media companies should be able to advertise their new brand in order to build loyal readership. That's not the same as saying that small media companies should be able to capture an arbitrage spread and just continue to buy paid traffic for 5 cents and monetize a landing page for 6 cents.
And one more question with Jared that comes with a bit of a disclaimer as well. It said also in New Orleans, we had someone from the buy side who said that the buy side doesn't actually care about the MFA label and cares more about carbon footprint. So who is driving this labeling and why if the buy side doesn't care? And it comes with the parentheses that says, sorry, this was a hot topic in NOLA and it wasn't fair for Chris because he wasn't there and was talked about. I don't know.
I was talked about? Come on. I mean, there's a variety of reasons that I think buyers should avoid made for advertising. Yes, it's a disproportionate contributor to the industry's carbon emissions. I don't know how buyers weigh these things, but to me, like, there's really only one reason. It doesn't drive sales. Like, there's just very good data to substantiate that, like, there's certain giant pools of supply that are very good at hitting certain vanity metrics like high viewability and low costs, but the ads on those websites don't influence consumer purchase decisions. And that's why you should block them.
Okay. And we do have one more. I kind of do know your opinion on this just because we've had conversations about it. But Helene Parker wanted to know what was your POV about the Digiday article that came out where diverse-owned pubs were being incorrectly labeled as MFA sites or MFAA sites now, she said.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to react to. I guess there's an assertion in some of those Digiday stories that Black-owned media companies are being incorrectly labeled as MFA, but like who? Which ones? Like I would fix my data tomorrow if like I knew what these examples are, but I think they're anonymous. I don't know. What I would say is because that got some pickup, you take that stuff seriously, right? Like, is it possible that some of the work we're doing is inadvertently harming diverse-owned media? It's like, that's something we need to take really seriously, right? And so I actually spent quite a bit of my time like looking into this and trying to understand the basic shape of at least our MFA list. And I think there are two things that are worth highlighting here. One is, yes, absolutely 100%, there are diverse-owned media companies that we classify as made for advertising because they meet our standards for being classified as made for advertising. In aggregate, we classify about 20% of all auctions as MFA. We classify 0.2% of auctions from diverse-owned media as MFA, meaning I think there's an assertion in here somewhere that like Black-owned media is disproportionately hurt by MFA blocking efforts. At least using our data, it's exactly the opposite. When media buyers use our data to block MFA supply, they block a very significant portion of non-diverse-owned media and a teeny tiny sliver of diverse-owned media. And the result is that spend rebalances toward diverse-owned media. Now, there will be individual diverse-owned media companies who are labeled MFA who, of course, hate that. But if your goal is to sort of like make sure that at least spend allocation remains steady, but ideally shifts toward diverse-owned media, which I think has a credible claim to sort of saying like, no, there's been underinvestment historically. Blocking made for advertising is a great way to do that. You block a lot of non-diverse-owned media and a very tiny slice of diverse-owned media, and spend shifts toward diverse-owned media companies.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm seeing some commentary, just a general around the MFA conversation. We have Kristen Moling, who said MFA and carbon emissions go hand in hand, and which is very true. Actually, we had one of our freelancers write an article recently about how increased carbon emissions is a good sign of that you're an MFA site. So please do go check that out. And we do also have a couple other comments from Helene Parker, who said buyers make decisions based on KPI and campaign performance first. And also just another suggestion about the topic of diversity, maybe we should have someone from Bomisi in this conversation, which I think would be an amazing idea. It's something I'm definitely open to doing. And let me see if we have any more questions before I move on to our final prediction. Okay, and finally, for our final prediction or icebreaker, we covered a lot of topics over this conversation, but of course, we couldn't cover them all within an hour. The ad tech industry is so vast and goes through so many different changes. So, is there any topic or opinions that you kind of want to give your prediction on for 2024 to kind of end things off?
Well, look, I think the two parts of this thing. I think the main change that happened in our industry in 2023 is media buyers feeling more confident that it is appropriate and really necessary to apply business oversight on top of all of the automation. Made for advertising is the thing that sort of cemented that media buyers realized, like, for all of the smart bidding logic, for all the smart measurement, we were buying a bunch of supply that we're pretty convinced was a bad investment. And it's appropriate and necessary for us to make media buying decisions, for us to act as marketers and say, like, you know what, I trust company A, B, and C. I've never heard of companies D, E, and F. And until I get comfortable with companies D, E, and F, I'm not going to buy any of their supply. Had marketers done that, they would have almost perfectly insulated themselves from made for advertising inventory and a whole host of other ad tech fiascos. I think we're going to see more movement in that direction. And it's back to the thing, I forget who raised this before. It's back to the thing about moving toward inclusionless. That's great, with one very big watch out. When marketers make inclusion lists, which again, I think that's a big thing that's going to happen in 2024, moving toward inclusion lists, they will include the biggest publishers. They're not going to forget Disney or Warner Brothers Discovery or Hearst or Condé Nast. They're also not going to forget, at least within the agencies who are quite sophisticated about this stuff, they're not going to forget the big sales houses that aggregate the long tail. They're not going to forget Raptive. They're not going to forget Mediavine. They're not going to forget Freestar. But you know what they're going to forget? They're going to forget those mid-market publishers that are great, but that are just like too small to be worthy of evaluating. And I think there's a real possibility here that we see a collapse of the middle in the industry, and that mid-market publishers find themselves not blocked, but just not included. And that leaves them with like a real scarcity of demand. And then they're in this difficult position where it's either like, all right, we got to make some like major investments in technology and sales and marketing in order to be on this sort of like preferred inclusion list for all the agencies, or like we need to consider joining one of these sales houses. And that's for sure already happening at a lot of mid-market publishers.
And we actually do have one more 2024 prediction question from Helene. I love all these questions, Helene. Keep them coming. Is 2024 the rise of audio since the last two were the rise of CTV and OTT?
I don't see any growth in the audio space. I mean, any needle-moving growth in the audio space. Maybe, but I don't feel like I can weigh in there.
Okay, makes sense. Well, thank you again, Chris, for joining us for this LinkedIn Live. I really enjoyed having this conversation, and with all the comments coming in, I'm sure the audience did as well. And before we kind of end things off, of course, I wanted to promo some of AdMonsters events that we have coming up next year. We have 3 pub forum events, one in Austin, March 3rd through 5th, one in Boston, August 4th through 6th, and one in Scottsdale in November 10th through 12th. And of course, we have our AdMonsters Ops event in New York, June 3rd through 4th. We also have an exciting new CTV event, CTV Connect, March 13th through 14th, where 4 brands, Ad Exchanger, Synopsys, AdMonsters, and Chief Marketer, will be coming together to talk all things CTV. And of course, before you go, check us out on social media. Check us out on the AdMonsters website. We post content often. And of course, if you want to contribute anything, we are always looking for publisher and ad tech vendors to contribute to our sites. Again, thank you again for joining us. I really enjoyed this conversation. Hope you guys did too, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again.